Cartoons might look innocent, but some characters carry a storm wherever they go. What happens when a goofy sidekick or a silly animal becomes a lightning rod for outrage? From outdated stereotypes to jokes that aged like milk, entire characters have been pulled from screens for being just too much. So here's the real question. Were they truly dangerous or just products of their time? Strap in, because some of these faces are more infamous than famous. Pepe Le Pew, Looney Tunes. Few characters capture the love him or hate him energy quite like Pepe Le Pew. On the surface, he's a cartoon skunk waddling through Paris with exaggerated charm. But in modern eyes, his relentless pursuit of Penelope Pussycat feels less like slapstick and more like a dated relic. What once played as comedic persistence is now read as pushing boundaries far too hard. When Warner Brothers first introduced Pepe in the late 1940s, audiences laughed at the over-the-top French accent, the swooning, and the dramatic music. He even won an Academy Award in 1949 for sentimental reasons. Yet as cultural attitudes shifted, the humor didn't hold up. Critics pointed out how his antics blurred the line between silly romance and uncomfortable insistence. The real turning point came in the 2010s when Pepe suddenly disappeared from new Looney Tunes productions, a planned scene in Space Jam. A new legacy was completely cut, sparking debate. Some argued it was overdue, others said it was erasing history. Either way, Pepe went from Saturday morning regular to modern-day exile. What's fascinating is how Pepe embodies a larger shift. Comedy built on persistence and misunderstanding once ruled the airwaves, but modern audiences have less patience for jokes that punch down or ignore boundaries. Warner Brothers decided to play it safe, quietly shelving him instead of reimagining him. So today, Pepe is less a character and more a case study in cultural evolution. He's proof that even a cartoon skunk can't outrun the clock of changing values. Speedy Gonzalez, Looney Tunes. The fastest mouse in all Mexico was once a beloved character, and then suddenly he was gone. Speedy Gonzalez, introduced in 1953, was celebrated for his quick wit, bright sombrero, and signature yell. Kids loved him, and he became one of Looney Tunes' most recognizable stars. But as years went by, Speedy became a lightning rod for criticism. Advocates argued that the exaggerated accent, the oversized sombrero, and the sleepy sidekicks played into lazy stereotypes. Networks like Cartoon Network even pulled Speedy cartoons entirely in the early 2000s, citing sensitivity to how the character portrayed Mexican culture. The decision sparked heated debate. But here's the twist. Latino audiences rallied around him. Groups like the League of United Latin American Citizens publicly defended Speedy, calling him a positive figure, smart, heroic, and always outwitting bigger foes. In many ways, Speedy was seen as a rare representation of a Mexican hero in American cartoons. For fans, he was never the problem. He was the champion. By the mid-2000s, Speedy returned to television. Warner Brothers acknowledged the controversy, but leaned into the character's popularity, making him a recurring presence in new shows like the Looney Tunes show in 2011. What Speedy's story proves is that controversy doesn't always equal cancellation. Sometimes fans fight back, and the character gets a second chance. While some still see him as outdated, others call him an icon. Either way, Speedy Gonzalez is a reminder that context matters and that audiences can decide what survives. Uncle Ruckus, The Boondocks. Jump forward to the 2000s, and you'll find Uncle Ruckus, a character who seems almost designed to offend. The Boondocks was never shy about controversy, but Ruckus stood out even in that lineup. He's a self-hating man who constantly spouts absurd, outdated beliefs, and the show uses him to expose the ridiculousness of prejudice. When Aaron McGruder created the Boondocks in 2005, Uncle Ruckus was meant to be satire. He was exaggerated to the point of parody, a mirror held up to the ugliest attitudes still lurking in society. For fans of sharp, biting humor, he was hilarious. But for others, he went too far. The controversy didn't come from what he did physically, but from what he said. His language was intentionally over the top, but some viewers found it difficult to separate parody from endorsement. Critics questioned whether a mainstream cartoon should even portray such a character, even if the point was to mock those ideas. Yet, Ruckus also became a cult favorite. The contradiction is what makes him fascinating. He's both deeply offensive and sharply effective as satire. The showrunners leaned into that tension, never softening him, and audiences debated his role every step of the way. Uncle Ruckus is proof that controversy doesn't always end a character's life. Sometimes it fuels it, but it also shows how razor-thin the line is between edgy comedy and crossing into territory that viewers simply won't tolerate. Ren and Stimpy, Ren and Stimpy Show. When Nickelodeon premiered the Ren and Stimpy Show in 1991, it looked like just another quirky kids' cartoon. Instead, it became one of the most divisive animated shows of the decade. At the center were Ren, a psychotic chihuahua, and Stimpy, a dim-witted cat. Their adventures weren't about gentle fun, they were surreal, grotesque, and often downright bizarre. The show's humor leaned on exaggerated violence, grotesque close-ups, and outrageous gags that pushed way past what Saturday morning audiences were used to. Parents complained, advocacy groups protested. But kids? They couldn't stop watching. The show quickly became a cult hit. Ren and Stimpy's controversy wasn't about one joke, it was about tone. One moment they'd parody classic cartoons, the next they'd launch into absurd, disturbing humor that felt way out of place for Nickelodeon. Networks were constantly censoring scenes, editing episodes, and even pulling some entirely. Behind the scenes, the show's creator, John Kricfalusi, clashed with Nickelodeon executives over how far was too far. By 1992, he was fired, and the network took control. But the damage, or brilliance, was already done. Ren and Stimpy had burned themselves into animation history as too weird, too extreme, and too influential to ignore. What's undeniable is how much the show changed cartoons. Without Ren and Stimpy, there'd be no SpongeBob, no Adventure Time, no wave of surreal humor that came after. They were controversial, yes, but also groundbreaking. Sometimes being too much is exactly what sets the stage for the future. Quagmire, Family Guy. If Family Guy thrives on pushing buttons, then Glenn Quagmire is the one jamming the control panel. From the very beginning, Quagmire was drawn as the eccentric neighbor with a loud catchphrase and an even louder personality. But what made him funny in the late 90s doesn't exactly land the same way in the 2020s. His ladies' man routine was played as over-the-top satire, but critics quickly noticed how often his gags relied on one-dimensional jokes. What once got laughs as edgy humor now reads as tone-deaf. Several episodes featuring Quagmire have even been pulled or trimmed for reruns, proving that even in a show built on controversy, there are lines. The fascinating part is how Family Guy doubled down. Instead of quietly retiring him, the writers leaned into the criticism, making Quagmire more absurd and self-parodying. They gave him bizarre backstories, odd obsessions, and turned him into almost a caricature of his original caricature. Still, the backlash lingers. While some fans defend Quagmire as satirical, others argue that his humor simply hasn't aged well. He exists in a strange middle ground, too exaggerated to be realistic, yet too recognizable not to spark debate. Quagmire shows how a cartoon character can become a cultural weather vane. What audiences once shrugged off can later become a symbol of everything that feels out of step. And if you've noticed he's featured less in newer seasons, that's not an accident. Beavis and Butt-Head, Beavis and Butt-Head. In 1993, MTV unleashed Beavis and Butt-Head, and parents everywhere panicked. These two slack-jawed teens spent their days watching music videos, mocking everything, and laughing at jokes no adult dared admit were funny. The show was crude, loud, and deliberately dumb, and that was the point. But when real-life incidents started making headlines, the outrage exploded. In one widely reported case, parents claimed a child copied the characters' reckless antics. Whether or not that was true, the connection stuck. Lawmakers, parent groups, and even late-night news shows piled on, blaming the cartoon for inspiring bad behavior. MTV scrambled to respond. Episodes were edited, time slots shifted to late-night hours, and certain words were banned from the characters' vocabulary. Yet none of that stopped the debate. Were Beavis and Butt-Head harmless satire of teen culture or an influence that went way too far? Despite the backlash, the show thrived. Its popularity made it impossible to bury. Mike Judge, the creator, leaned into the criticism, making the boys even more absurd. Eventually, the show was canceled in 1997, but it didn't die. It returned in 2011 and again in 2022, each time sparking the same old debates. Beavis and Butt-Head's legacy is clear. They weren't dangerous, but they were the perfect scapegoat for a generation's anxiety about media influence. The outrage was almost the fuel that made them legendary. Mr. Popo, Dragon Ball Z. Anime imports have often raised eyebrows in the West, and few characters sparked more backlash than Mr. Popo from Dragon Ball Z. Introduced in the late 1980s in Japan, Mr. Popo was meant to be the loyal assistant to Kami, the guardian of Earth. But when the show reached American audiences, his design ignited controversy. The exaggerated features and pitch black skin tone were immediately criticized as playing into outdated caricatures. By the early 2000s, networks like Cartoon Network and streaming services began rethinking his design. In some versions, Mr. Popo was recolored completely blue, an almost surreal attempt to sidestep criticism without cutting him out entirely. Fans were divided. Some argued that the controversy overlooked his role in the story. He wasn't a villain or a clown, but a powerful mentor figure who helped train heroes like Goku. Others countered that intent didn't erase impact and that design choices can't be separated from how they're perceived. Today, Mr. Popo remains one of anime's most debated characters in the West. While Japanese audiences largely saw him without controversy, his legacy abroad shows how cultural differences can transform a cartoon character into a lightning rod. He's a reminder that context matters, and that what works in one country might not work in another. Clutch Cargo, 1960. If you've ever seen old footage of Clutch Cargo, you probably did a double take. Something about the characters just feels wrong. That's because this short-lived adventure cartoon used a bizarre technique called synchrovox, where real human mouths were superimposed over static cartoon faces. The result? Characters that looked frozen in time until their very realistic lips started moving. Back in 1960, this was meant to be cutting-edge technology. Instead, it became nightmare fuel. Kids found it unsettling, critics mocked it, and the technique was abandoned almost as quickly as it appeared. But what really made Clutch Cargo controversial wasn't just the uncanny visuals. It was the idea that a show for children would use such cheap tricks and still try to pass itself off as television entertainment. Even at the time, it drew backlash from parents who thought it was lazy and disturbing. Cartoons were supposed to be lively, colorful, and full of motion, not stiff drawings with pasted-on mouths. As decades passed, Clutch Cargo turned into a cult curiosity, resurfacing in parodies on The Simpsons and Late Night with Conan O'Brien. Today, the show is mostly remembered as an example of how far animators were willing to push technology, even if the results were unsettling. Clutch Cargo wasn't banned, but it was widely ridiculed and quietly shelved. Modern audiences see it less as a relic and more as proof that not every experiment should make it to prime time. Despite the backlash, Herbert became a recurring presence. His oddball personality and unexpected musical numbers cemented him as both infamous and unforgettable. But unlike other controversial characters, Herbert's appearances are more limited now, suggesting even the creators recognize the shifting tolerance of audiences. Herbert proves that sometimes controversy is baked into the DNA of a character. He wasn't created to be safe, he was created to provoke. And that's exactly why he remains one of the most polarizing figures in animation. So there you have it, 15 cartoon characters too hot for modern TV, each carrying a story about changing times and shifting values. Were they unfairly judged, or did they deserve to fade out of view? That's for you to decide. Drop a comment with the one you think should make a comeback, hit like if you grew up watching them, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden corners of cartoon history. After all, sometimes the characters we weren't supposed to see tell us the most about the world that made them.